He watched her from the shadow of the East Gallery, where the plaster had crumbled enough to allow a narrow line of sight into the servants' corridor below. The woman, Dorothea Ashwick, 31 years old, assistant archivist at the Whitmore estate, was doing something she had no business doing. She was patching a crack in the wall of the disused scullery with a mixture of horsehair plaster and what appeared to be dried lavender, and she was doing it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. Lord Caius Marden had lived inside the walls of this estate for 2 years. Not metaphorically, he occupied the spaces between rooms, the sealed servant passages, the bricked-over corridors, the hollow gaps behind chimney breasts that the builders of 1743 had left for reasons no one alive remembered. He slept in a chamber that existed on no floor plan, ate nothing that required a kitchen, and moved through the house like a draft that no one could locate. And yet this woman was sealing every gap, every crack, every passage he used to enter the habitable parts of the house. She had been doing it systematically for 3 weeks now, working her way from the ground floor upward, and she had not told anyone she was doing it. She was also the woman he had met 11 years ago in a bookshop on Charing Cross Road, the one who had helped a stranger reach a volume on the top shelf and then corrected his Latin pronunciation of the title with such casual precision that he had stood in the doorway for a full minute after she left, holding the book and forgetting why he had wanted it. He did not remember this. He had lived 437 years, and a moment in a bookshop was less than a grain of sand in the architecture of his memory. She remembered. Dorothea pressed the plaster into the crack with the flat of a palette knife, smoothing it until the surface was flush. The lavender was not decorative. She had noticed over the past several months that certain walls in the estate breathed, not metaphorically, but actually seemed to exhale cool air that carried a scent she could not identify. Something mineral and old, like stone that had never seen sunlight. She had begun cataloging the locations in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. 17 points of airflow on the ground floor, 12 on the first floor. The pattern suggested an internal system of passages that was not documented in any of the estate records she maintained. She set down the palette knife and pulled the notebook from her pocket. 18, she said aloud, writing the number. She had developed this habit years ago, speaking her counts, because numbers felt more real when she heard them. It steadied her. She wrote the location, the date, and the quality of the airflow. Steady, cool, faintly sweet. Behind the wall, less than 2 feet from where her hand rested, Caius held perfectly still. His chest did not rise. The trouble had started 6 weeks ago, when Mr. Edgar Pruitt, the estate's solicitor and a man whose smile had the warmth of a February puddle, had arrived with a surveyor and announced that the Whitmore Family Trust intended to sell the East Wing to a development company. This would require a full architectural survey, which would require opening every sealed passage in the house, which would require finding what lived inside them. Dorothea had worked at Whitmore for 4 years, and for 3 of those years she had been invisible. She maintained the estate's paper records, deeds, correspondence, household accounts dating back 2 centuries, in a small office on the ground floor that smelled of beeswax and old ink. She was good at her work. She was quiet about being good at it, and until Edgar Pruitt had arrived with his surveyor, no one had paid her the slightest attention. That changed on a Tuesday in November, when Pruitt summoned her to the main hall and informed her, in front of the housekeeper, the head gardener, 2 members of the trust's board, that her archive records were incomplete and that this incompetence might delay the sale by months. The accusation was specific. She had failed to catalog a set of architectural drawings from 1743 that would show the original layout of the East Wing, including all internal passages. Without these drawings, the survey could not proceed. Without the survey, the sale would collapse. The trust would lose £40,000. And this, Pruitt said, adjusting his cuffs with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the gesture, would be her responsibility. Dorothea looked at him. She looked at the 2 board members who would not meet her eyes. She looked at the housekeeper, Mrs. Nell Barrow, who was standing very still with her hands clasped and her jaw set at an angle that suggested she was preventing herself from saying something that would end her employment. Mr. Pruitt, Dorothea said, her voice level and unhurried, The 1743 drawings were removed from this archive in 1891 by your predecessor, Mr. Howell, and transferred to the county records office in Bath. I have the transfer receipt. I filed a copy with your office in March." She paused, then added, with the careful precision of someone delivering a correction she had been waiting 3 years to make. 19, she said quietly, noting the number of times she had submitted paperwork to Pruitt's office that had been ignored. Pruitt's smile did not falter. It rarely did. That was what made him effective. "Then you will retrieve them," he said. "You have until Friday." Bath was a day's journey each way. It was Wednesday. He turned to the board members and began discussing the timeline as if she had already left the room. Dorothea stood for a moment longer, the palette knife still in her apron pocket, the lavender plaster drying on her fingers. She did not break. She gathered her notebook, inclined her head to Mrs. Barrow, and walked toward the corridor. She did not see the man standing in the alcove beside the main staircase, half hidden by a column and the particular quality of shadow that clung to him as if it preferred his company. She did not see his eyes, gray and deep and old, follow her across the hall. She did not see the way his hand tightened on the column's edge, or the way the stone cracked, very slightly, beneath his fingers. But Mrs. Barrow did. The housekeeper found Dorothea in the archive office 20 minutes later, shoving papers into a leather satchel with the controlled fury of someone who had learned that controlled fury was the only kind that did not get you dismissed. "You are not going to Bath," Mrs. Barrow said, closing the door behind her. She was a woman of 53 with silver-streaked hair, a voice like warm sandstone, and an absolute inability to tolerate nonsense. She had run the Whitmore estate for 19 years and had outlasted 4 solicitors, 3 board members, one spectacularly incompetent footman who had tried to polish the silver with boot blacking. "I have to," Dorothea said. "If I don't produce those drawings by Friday, he'll use it as grounds to dismiss me. And he wants to dismiss me, Nell. He's wanted to since I pointed out the discrepancy in the timber accounts. Of course he wants to dismiss you. You're the only person in this house who reads his paperwork." Mrs. Barrow settled into the chair opposite the desk with the air of someone who intended to stay. "But you are not going to Bath because those drawings are not in Bath." Dorothea stopped packing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mrs. Barrow said, "that I have worked in this house since before you were born. I know perfectly well that the 1743 plans were never sent to any county office. They were hidden by the family, because those plans show something the family did not want anyone to find." Dorothea sat down slowly. The chair creaked beneath her. The archive smelled of beeswax and dust and the faint lavender that had worked its way into everything she touched. "What do they show?" she asked. "Passages," Mrs. Barrow said. "An entire network of them, built into the walls. And before you ask, yes, I know about your little notebook with the airflow measurements. You are not as subtle as you think, my dear." She paused, and her expression shifted into something more complicated. "Also, I should mention that someone is living in those passages, has been for approximately 2 years." The silence that followed had a physical weight. Dorothea felt it settle across her shoulders like a hand. 20, she said, almost inaudibly. 20 impossible things she had noticed in this house and chosen not to examine. That night, she did not go home to her small cottage at the edge of the estate grounds. She stayed in the archive, working by lamplight, and at 11:30 she heard a sound in the wall behind her desk that was not the building settling. It was footsteps. She pressed her hand flat against the wall. The stone was cold, far colder than it should have been in a room with a fire burning. She felt beneath her palm the faintest vibration, as if something on the other side had pressed back. She did not move away. She took a slow breath. Then she said clearly and without fear, into the wall, "How's the rent?" The silence that followed was different from the one before. This silence was startled. And then, very quietly, from somewhere behind the plaster and the stone and the 400 years of accumulated darkness, a voice said, "Negotiable." He came through a panel in the library at midnight. She was waiting for him, sitting in the leather chair beside the dead fire with her notebook open on her knee and a lamp turned low. She had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Someone furtive, perhaps. Someone small. He was not small. Caius Martin stepped into the room like a man stepping onto a stage he had once owned. He was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in clothes that were well-made but belonged to a decade she could not quite place. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His skin, in the lamplight, had the quality of something that had not seen direct sun in a very long time. His eyes were gray and careful, and when he looked at her, she felt the specific sensation of being truly seen. Not her role, not her position, not her usefulness, but her. She recognized him. Not from the house, from a bookshop on Charing Cross Road 11 years ago, where a man who did not know how to pronounce Catullus had asked her to reach a book. She had corrected him, and he had smiled in a way that had stayed with her like a pressed flower in a book she returned to often. He did not recognize her. "You've been sealing my corridors," he said. "You've been living in my walls," she said. "Technically," he said, "these are the Whitmore family's walls." "Technically," she said, "you do not appear on any tenancy record I have ever filed." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. He sat down in the chair opposite hers, moving with a deliberateness that suggested he was being very careful about how much speed he displayed. She noticed that his chest did not rise when he sat still. She noticed, and she catalogued the observation alongside the cold walls and the airflow and the lavender-scented breath of the house, and she said nothing about it. Mrs. Barrow appeared in the doorway with a tray bearing 2 cups of tea and a plate of shortbread. She set it down on the table between them, looked from one to the other, said, "Well, this is either the beginning of something very interesting or the end of something very stupid. Either way, drink your tea." She left. The tea smelled of bergamot and warmth and ordinary life. Dorothea noticed that Caius looked at the cup but did not touch it. 21, she said quietly. Over the following week, the arrangement became practical. Caius needed to remain hidden until the question of the estate sale was resolved. If Pruitt's surveyors found the passages, they would find evidence of habitation. Questions would follow that could not be safely answered. Dorothea needed the 1743 architectural plans to protect her position and to understand exactly what Pruitt intended to do with the East Wing. Caius knew where the plans were. They were in his room, the sealed chamber behind the third chimney breast on the second floor, where he had been living among the documents and furniture of a family that no longer knew he existed. He brought them to her in the archive on the second night. She unrolled them on the desk, and the smell of old paper rose between them. Foxed and fragile, the ink faded to sepia. Their hands were close on the paper's edge. His fingers were cold, hers were warm from the lamp. Neither of them moved away. She traced the passage network with her fingertip. "It's extensive," she said. 3 floors connecting every major room. Someone built an entire second house inside this one. "The first Lord Whitmore," Caius said. He paused, choosing his words the way a man chooses his steps near a cliff edge. "He was like me." Dorothea looked at him. The lamplight caught the gray of his eyes and made them silver. She had been counting anomalies for months. Cold walls, absent breath, a voice that carried the quality of centuries, not decades. "You don't eat," she said. "You don't breathe when you think I'm not watching. Your skin is the temperature of marble, and you have been alive much longer than any person should be." He said nothing. His stillness was absolute, the stillness of something that did not need to move to sustain itself. "Say it," she said. "I am a vampire," he said. 22, she said. "That's the 22nd impossible thing about this house." And then, to his visible surprise, she did not recoil. She sat back in her chair and said, "You corrected your Latin pronunciation. After I left the bookshop, I saw you through the window, mouthing it to yourself." He stared at her. The memory surfaced like something long submerged, a flash of brown hair, a voice that carried warmth and precision in equal measure, a woman who had reached the top shelf without being asked and handed him the book with a correction he had not requested but had never forgotten. "That was you," he said. "That was me," she said. The silence between them was no longer startled. It was something else entirely, something warm and aching and full of years. But they did not touch. The distance between their chairs might as well have been an ocean, because she knew what he was and he did not remember who she was. Both of those facts needed more than one night to resolve. 3 days later, Pruitt returned. He did not come alone. He brought a woman named Mrs. Violet Kane, a member of the trust board, and more importantly, the person who held the casting vote on the sale. Mrs. Kane was elegant, sharp-eyed, and spoke with the cold courtesy of someone who had weaponized politeness decades ago. She cornered Dorothea in the entrance hall, in front of two estate workers and Mrs. Barrow. "I have reviewed your records, Miss Ashwick," Mrs. Kane said. Her voice was pleasant, her eyes were not, and I find them remarkably detailed for someone of your position. One might wonder what you are really looking for in all those old papers. Dorothea straightened her spine. "Accuracy is not suspicious, Mrs. Kane. It is simply my work done properly." 23 things she might say to this woman, she chose the mildest. Mrs. Kane smiled. "I've also learned that you've been conducting unauthorized repairs to the interior walls. Plasterwork, I'm told, in areas not assigned to your duties." She stepped closer. "If I were to conclude that you were deliberately concealing structural features from the surveyor, that would constitute obstruction. An obstruction, Miss Ashwick, is grounds for immediate dismissal and prosecution." The word prosecution landed in the hall like a stone dropped into water. The two estate workers looked at the floor. Mrs. Barrow's lips thinned to a seam. Dorothea's hands, hidden in her apron pockets, pressed flat against the palette knife. She breathed. She counted. "I was repairing drafts," Dorothea said. "The plaster was deteriorating. I used my own materials in my own time. If maintaining the building's condition is now considered obstruction, I suggest you put that in writing so we both have a record of it." Mrs. Kane's smile did not waver. Pruitt, standing behind her, allowed himself a small, satisfied expression. The expression of a man who had found a better weapon than his own authority. They left. That evening, Dorothea found a formal letter in her pigeonhole. She was suspended from archive duties, pending an investigation into unauthorized modifications to the estate's structure. She had 7 days to vacate her office. She sat in the archive with the letter in her hands and the 1743 plans spread across the desk, and she felt the careful architecture of her life, her position, her cottage, her work, begin to crack. The wall behind her breathed, cold air, faintly sweet. She did not turn around. "I know you're there," she said. Chaos stepped through the panel. His expression was controlled, but his hands were not. They were clenched at his sides, the knuckles white with a restraint that had nothing to do with calm. "I can end this," he said. "I can make Pruitt forget the sale. I can make Kane forget she was ever here. I have the ability." For the first time since the night they met, Dorothea looked at him and felt something close to fear. Not of him, but of the scope of what he was offering, the casual immensity of it, the implication that the world she navigated with such care was, to him, rearrangeable. "No," she said. He took a step toward her. "Dorothea, no." She stood. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook, and she did not hide them. "If you solve this for me, it will never be solved. They'll come back. Different faces, same intention. And I will still be the woman who needed a 400-year-old creature to fight her battles. I will not be that woman." He stopped. The restraint in him was visible, physical. The effort of a man who could move mountains choosing to stand still because she asked him to. "Then tell me what you need," he said. She looked at the plans on her desk. She looked at the letter in her hand. She looked at him. This impossible man who lived in walls, who had forgotten a bookshop but not a Latin correction, whose stillness was the most eloquent thing about him. "I need the Whitmore family's original trust documents," she said, "the ones that specify what can and cannot be sold. Because if this house was built by someone like you, then the trust was written by someone who knew what these walls contained. And I am willing to bet that someone made very sure the East Wing could never be separated from the rest." Mrs. Barrow found the documents. Not in the archive, not in the walls, but in a locked chest in the estate's wine cellar. A chest she had been stepping over for 19 years and had never once been curious about, which she announced with the magnificent self-reproach of a woman who prided herself on knowing everything. "I have failed in my duties as a nosy person," she said, carrying the chest into the archive with both hands. "I intend to make up for it immediately." Inside were the original trust deeds, written in 1743 in a hand that Dorothea now recognized. She had been looking at it on the architectural plans for a week. The First Lord Whitmore. the first vampire to call this place home. The trust was specific. The estate could not be divided. No wing, no passage, no structural element could be sold separately from the whole. The clause was buried in legal language that had been deliberately archaic even for its time, as if the writer had wanted to make it as difficult as possible for anyone to understand or challenge. Dorothea understood it. She spent 2 days translating the relevant clauses into plain English, cross-referencing them with the current trust provisions, building a case that the proposed sale was not merely inadvisable but legally impossible. On the 6th day of her suspension, she sent a copy to every member of the trust board except Pruitt and Mrs. Kane. On the 7th day, Pruitt called a meeting. He had anticipated her. That was what she had not expected. When she arrived at the main hall with her documents and her carefully prepared presentation, she found that Pruitt had brought his own solicitor, a man named Fellows, who produced a revised interpretation of the trust clause that argued the original language was ambiguous and subject to modern reinterpretation. It was clever. It was, technically, arguable, and it meant that Dorothea's carefully built case was suddenly insufficient. She stood in the hall with her papers in her hands and felt the ground shift beneath her. The board members looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Kane looked triumphant. Pruitt adjusted his cuffs. 24, Dorothea said, quietly enough that only Mrs. Barrow heard her. The housekeeper put a hand on her arm. Then Dorothea noticed something. Fellows' revised interpretation referenced a codicil, an amendment to the original trust, that she had never seen. It was dated 1802 and signed by the second Lord Whitmore. If it existed, it changed everything. If it didn't exist, then Fellows' entire argument was built on a fiction. She needed the codicil. She needed to know whether it was real. She found Caius in the passage behind the library. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the stone, and in the light of her candle, he looked tired. Not physically, deeply, fundamentally, in the way that only centuries of the same posture could produce. There is a codicil from 1802, she said. Is it real? He looked up at her. The candlelight moved across his face, and she saw, for a moment, the full weight of what he carried. Not power, not danger, but loneliness so dense it had its own gravity. It's real, he said. The second Lord Whitmore wrote it to allow the sale of the stables. But it was conditional. It required the unanimous consent of all living beneficiaries. He paused. I am a living beneficiary, in a manner of speaking. Dorothea felt the plan reform itself in her mind, like a river finding a new course. If the codicil requires unanimous consent, then no part of this estate can be sold without my agreement, he said. And I do not agree. But that means you have to appear, she said, in person, in front of the board. The silence between them was the kind that changes things. I know, he said. The meeting was convened 3 days later in the main hall. Pruitt had ensured a full board attendance, 7 members, plus Mrs. Kane, plus his solicitor Fellows. Dorothea had been permitted to attend in her capacity as archivist, though Pruitt had made clear this was a courtesy, not a right. Mrs. Barrow stood at the back of the room with the quiet authority of someone who had no official role but absolute moral jurisdiction. Pruitt opened with his revised proposal. Fellows presented the 1802 codicil. The board members nodded along with the comfortable rhythm of people who had already decided. Then Dorothea stood. If the board will permit, she said, I would like to present the original trust provisions alongside the codicil in question. She distributed her documents. Clear, annotated, precise. 7 copies, each bookmarked. She had spent 3 nights preparing them, and they were flawless. She explained the original clause. She explained the codicil. She explained that the codicil did not replace the original clause, but supplemented it, and that its supplemental condition required unanimous consent from all living beneficiaries. Pruitt cut in. All living beneficiaries have been consulted, he said. The Whitmore line ended in 1896. It did not, Dorothea said. The door to the main hall opened. The hinges did not creak. They would not dare. Caius Martin walked into the room. He did not walk the way ordinary men walk into rooms. He walked with the weight of someone who had crossed this particular threshold before the plaster was dry. The board members turned. Mrs. Kane's composure cracked, a visible fissure, quickly repaired, but not quickly enough. Pruitt went very still. Caius wore clothes that fit the present decade, though on him they looked like a concession. His hair was cut, his bearing was precise, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular authority of someone who did not need to raise it. "My name is Caius Marden," he said. "I am a direct descendant of the Whitmore family through the maternal line. I hold beneficiary status under the original trust provisions, which I can document." He set a leather folder on the table. The documents inside were old, genuinely old, not aged for effect, and they bore seals that two of the board members recognized immediately. "This is absurd," Pruitt said. His composure had slipped. "Where has this person been?" "Living in the estate," Dorothea said, her voice clear and steady, "as the trust intended." Which is more than can be said for the solicitor who failed to identify a beneficiary in his own client roster. The board members were reading the documents. One of them, an elderly man with reading glasses, looked up at Pruitt with an expression that suggested questions would follow. Difficult ones. Mrs. Kane tried once more. "This proves nothing. These documents could be forged. They are held in the county records office in Bath," Dorothea said, "where they have been since 1891. I retrieved them 3 days ago. 25 pieces of evidence, Mrs. Kane. Would you like me to count them aloud, or shall I let the board read at their own pace?" The room was very quiet. Mrs. Barrow at the back allowed herself a smile, small, fierce, and deeply satisfied. Pruitt gathered his papers. "This matter will require further review." "This matter is concluded," Caius said. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. "As a beneficiary, I formally withhold consent for any sale, division, or structural alteration of this estate. The board may note my objection." He looked at the board members, each of them. In turn, they looked back at him and saw something they could not name but could not ignore. A gravity, a permanence, an authority that had nothing to do with legal documents. Then Caius turned to Dorothea. He did this slowly, deliberately, in front of every person in the room. "Miss Ashwick," he said, "I owe this house its survival, but I owe you considerably more than that." He did not say what he owed her. He did not need to. Every person in the room understood, including Mrs. Barrow, who said, under her breath but not quietly enough, "Finally." Dorothea looked at him. This man who had lived in walls, who had forgotten a bookshop, who had remembered it again, who had walked into this room and stood beside her instead of in front of her. "You still haven't paid rent," she said. He almost smiled. The room saw it in the feared, ancient, impossible man undone by an archivist with a palette knife and a notebook full of counted impossibilities. "Negotiable," he said. "Not anymore," she said. She was smiling, and the smile was the kind that rewrites the terms of every arrangement. "I have terms." "Name them," he said. "Dinner," she said. "Tomorrow, somewhere with Latin on the menu so I can correct your pronunciation again." The board meeting dissolved after that into the particular chaos of 7 people realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary and having no procedural framework for it. Pruitt left without speaking to anyone. Mrs. Kane left with him. They would not return. 3 months later, the estate was quiet in the way that well-loved houses are quiet. Not empty, but settled. Full of the particular hum of lives being lived inside walls that had earned their rest. Dorothea had been reinstated as archivist within a week of the board meeting. Within a month, Pruitt's firm had been replaced. Within 2, Mrs. Kane had resigned from the board, citing personal reasons that everyone understood to mean professional humiliation. Caius no longer lived in the walls. He lived in the East Wing, in rooms that Dorothea had helped him furnish with the practical sensibility of a woman who understood that a 400-year-old vampire did not need 17 chairs, but might benefit from decent curtains. He had struggled with the curtains. "These are not the correct color," he had said, holding 2 fabric samples that were, to any human eye, identical shades of blue. "They are exactly the same," Dorothea had said. "One is cold," he had said, with the absolute certainty of a man who had spent centuries in darkness and had opinions about it. "The other is almost right." She had chosen the almost right one. He had not complained again. The passage network remained. They had decided together. An actual conversation. With disagreement and compromise in Mrs. Barrow's unsolicited but devastatingly accurate opinion, that the passages were part of the house's history and should be preserved, documented, and sealed only where structural safety required it. Dorothea had spent a week mapping them properly, with Caius as her guide, and the resulting document was the most thorough piece of architectural scholarship the estate had ever produced. She had counted every passage, every junction, every hidden room, 47 spaces in total. She had said the number aloud in the echoing dark of the deepest passage. Caius had listened to her voice fill the space and had said nothing, because some things were too large for words. On this particular evening in February, Dorothea sat at the kitchen table in the East Wing, a table she had insisted on, because a household needed a kitchen table even if only one member of the household ate food. And she was working on the estate's quarterly accounts, while the smell of rosemary and roasting potatoes filled the room. Caius stood in the doorway. He had a habit of standing in doorways, which she attributed to 2 years of passing through walls and never quite learning to commit to being in a room. He was watching her in the way he sometimes did, as if she were a book he had read once, long ago, in a language he was only now relearning. "You are staring," she said without looking up. "You are counting," under your breath, he said. 48, she said. 48 entries in the expense ledger this quarter. Mrs. Barrow ordered new silver polish again. I suspect she pours it directly into the North Sea. He crossed the kitchen. His footsteps were silent. They always were. But she felt the shift in air temperature as he approached. The cool presence of him arriving beside her like dusk arriving at a window. He placed his hand on the table, near hers, not touching, close enough that she could feel the cold emanating from his skin, and he could feel the warmth emanating from hers. They existed in this margin often, the space between almost and quite, because some distances are not meant to be closed quickly, and they had both learned patience from different teachers. His from centuries, hers from a lifetime of being overlooked. She set down her pen. She placed her hand over his. The cold of him met the warmth of her, and neither of them flinched. "I remember the bookshop," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me last week. I am telling you again." She looked up at him. His gray eyes held hers, and in them she saw not eternity, not darkness, not the terrible scope of what he was, but the specific, particular, irreducible fact of a man who had found someone worth remembering. "The potatoes will burn," she said. "Let them," he said. She laughed, the way people laugh when they have been given permission to want something and have finally, after long practice, accepted it. She squeezed his cold hand with her warm one. The kitchen filled with the smell of rosemary and the sound of a woman who had found her way home, not through a door, but through a wall. 49, she said softly. He raised an eyebrow. "Impossible things about this house," she said. "You're every single one of them." From the hallway, Mrs. Barrow's voice carried with the serene authority of a woman who had been eavesdropping without a shred of remorse. "If you two are finished being poetic, the rosemary has caught, and I refuse to let this kitchen burn down before I've finished the new inventory." Dorothea released his hand, stood, and rescued the potatoes. Caius opened a window. The February air rushed in, cold and clean, and smelling of frost and the particular promise that very old houses make to the people brave enough to love them. She set the dish on the table. He sat down across from her. The lamplight was steady between them, and outside the estate held its breath the way it always had. Not with cold, not with age, but with the quiet attention of walls that had been waiting for a very long time to stop being empty.